Wildfires. A growing threat to life in the UK. With a higher population and drier summers, the risk is increasing.
To the residents woken in the middle of the night, it seemed like their whole village was on fire.
It's burned for 3 days, and today the flames did nothing but grow and spread. This has now become a trial of strength for firefighters, a test of their will to overcome the worst wildfire on these moors in living memory.
Welcome to the Yorkshire Dales. I'm here today on a heather moorland, a habitat that has been affected badly by wildfires over the last few years. In fact, an area the size of Manchester, Newcastle and Southampton combined has been burnt each year. Lives have been put at risk, homes have been put at risk, countless endangered species have been put at risk, and on top of all that, underneath my feet is one of the most precious stores of carbon in the UK. Throughout this film, we're going to be looking at how best to negate the risk of wildfires and how wildfires over the last few years have affected local communities. Back in the summer, I met with a gamekeeper in the Peak District who has spent a lifetime helping prevent and control wildfires. I asked him what the future held for wildfires in Britain.
An increase.
Okay, why is that?
Undoubtedly an increase. Restrictions on management. For a start, we've been stopped the controlled burning that we've always been allowed to carry out historically, reducing the fuel load, increase in footfall, visitor numbers, and ultimately weather conditions. This is third spring on the trot now where we've been subjected to these drought-like conditions, a lot of east winds, little rainfall and these high temperatures, which is totally unseasonable.
What's a wildfire like?
Hell on earth, really. Anybody that's ever witnessed a wildfire or had the misfortune of having to fight one will tell you it's probably one of the worst places you can ever be. Trying to put peat out, the acrid smoke that comes off of burning peat gets into your lungs, the danger to life of the staff that are there trying to put it out, and all the time we're working knowing that this was preventable and knowing the damage that it's doing for future generations. I think some organisations do accept wildfire as a management technique. If they didn't, they would allow us to continue doing what we've always done, and it's prevented wildfires.
So Ian, what is controlled burning?
So controlled burning is just sort of managing the heather. As you can see out behind us, we have this mosaic of different ages of heather and different patterns. So what we do is we have cool fires through winter to break up and create this patchwork you can see behind us. So it's all very controlled. We have all the right kit, the machines to control these fires, and we're just sort of taking the surface canopy off.
And why do you do that?
Why we do that is to regenerate the heather. So you sort of burning off the old heather, taking off the canopy, letting the light come through and the young shoots come through of the heather. So the patchwork quilt effect that you can see here is just having all different ages of heather for feeding, for nesting, for cover, for shelter, for the grouse, and also it benefits all the waders as well. We've got a main road running through our moor there. If we didn't have this patchwork effect and all the heather was the same age, as we call it, fuel load, if people stop and have picnics and barbecues on the roadside there and a fire was happened to get away out of control, it would just take out this whole valley. This whole piece of moorland would just go in one. And the time of year when people are having barbecues is summer, so everything's breeding, all the chicks are out nesting, and the peat is getting drier.
Are wildfires a big risk on Bolton?
There's always that risk there, yeah. I think with the current weather patterns and the extreme weather conditions that we're experiencing over the last few years, the summers are getting drier, vegetation on the moors is drying out. But the management that we put in place creates that mosaic that we looked at earlier, creates the fire breaks, so really reduces the risk of any fires on a managed moor. But elsewhere in the country you've got bigger numbers of people and the risk goes through the roof.
Just another day.
It's like this every day.
Bank holiday weekends. This is on nice sunny days, this is a regular occurrence. You can see here there's a fire, this is a recent fire that was started by a campfire, barbecue, it's been something along those lines.
Do you get a lot of people barbecuing?
Oh yeah, bank holiday just gone, we dealt with 60 barbecues on bank holiday Monday alone. You know, it's advertised as a beauty spot, national
and
park.
It is beautiful.
Oh it is, you know, you can't deny it, it's lovely. You know, National Park advertise it as a great visitor place. Unfortunately, there's no means of policing them. There's just no control, we're just inundated with campfires, barbecues, antisocial behaviour, and then it's left to us to either try and control it or tidy up, mess up afterwards.
Are people appreciative when you talk to them about it?
No, I mean, we get threatened with violence, verbal abuse, there's been incidents of physical abuse. It's to the extent now where we've had to employ a private security firm to try and keep control of it, because it's just beyond us.
So it's people just not respecting that public access that they're granted?
Yeah, there's very little respect. I mean, you just have to take a look at this riverside and the amount of rubbish that's left behind.
It's unbelievable, isn't it?
It's an absolute tip. Yeah, I don't have an issue with people coming out enjoying the countryside, it's here for everybody. But what we have to deal with, it's the unseen problem, and you know, it's just horrendous. You know, like I say, for rural workers and residents, it's a living nightmare.
On our way out of the valley, we got the opportunity to hear from one of the local residents about her experiences.
We have serious issues with people who come, who picnic, who bring barbecues, they light fires, they ignore any of the signs, they park in front of the signs, as you can see with the bikes there. We've had 7 wildfires in the last 5 weeks. They're serious. We're in danger that if they set fire to this side, our houses could end up being at risk. It's dangerous to the wildlife. We're one of the few places in England that have got mountain hares. Their habitat's at risk. The birds nesting at the moment, they're all at risk. And it's just so unfair that we have to deal with this with no help whatsoever from the Peak Park.
It's clear to me that it's human impact that represents the greatest risk of wildfire in these areas. However, it's also human impact, that human intervention from land managers, that helps limit the risk of wildfires. I got the opportunity to go on a training day with moorland managers and the fire service to see how a controlled burn works.
So today we've carried out some cool consented burns on this area of the moor. We've picked out some mature beds of heather that was quite tall, and we've just taken some strips through that. We've been picking out areas where we think the fire will go out, got the wind direction behind us, and lit some strips of it and let the fire run to where we think the fire would go out. We've actually had Derbyshire Fire and Rescue here today. We've provided a bit of an opportunity to use some of their new equipment that they've purchased after all the recent wildfires in the last couple of years. The reason that we're doing these burns really brings 3 main benefits. Firstly, we're actually putting fire breaks into the ground, so should we get these wildfires in summer that we keep getting, these areas that are already burnt, it gives us a chance to actually get on top of the fire and hopefully get the fire out. The second benefit it brings, when the heather's burnt, it regenerates new growth, and that provides nutritious feed for the sheep, the mountain hares, and also the grouse to feed on. The third benefit is what we're trying to do is create a mosaic of all different age structures of heather, and that in turn benefits all the different species that come and nest here in the springtime. So the shorter, barer ground that's recently burnt will suit the lapwings and the curlews to come and nest on, whereas some of the more mature beds that are left to grow longer will suit merlin, short-eared owl to nest on. So it's just trying to create a diverse habitat for everything to thrive in, really. So some of the equipment that we use while we're heather burning, is mostly equipment to control the fire and stop it getting too big and out of hand. These fire beaters are the more traditional method, and these are basically used to stamp out the fire as you go along. In more modern times, most people now are using what we call a fogging unit, which is put on the back of an Argo cat to transport it round. And basically, it is just a high-powered pressure washer that's transportable on the Argo, and that's used to really douse the flames out and is very, very effective. We can also fill the fogging unit up with any stream or pond that's deep enough for us to draw water out of. So we don't need to go back to base to refill, we can actually refill while we're up here. And that's proved invaluable certainly on the wildfires over the last few years. So areas that we burn at the moment have to be consented through Natural England, and we have prior agreements and written maps as to where we can and can't burn. As it stands at this moment in time, any areas of dry heath, most of that we can burn over, which is ground of less than 40 centimetres peat depth underneath. Any of the deep peat ground, which is 40 centimetres or over of peat depth underneath, as it stands at the moment, we can't do any burning on whatsoever. So when we set out burning for the day, we follow our maps and pick areas that we are allowed to burn. The great concern across every moorland in the country now, if they have deep peat on the moor and they're not allowed to manage it in a way that's been traditionally done, we're going to see a huge, huge increase in summer wildfires.
Fires near Ilkley in West Yorkshire destroyed huge areas of important habitat for wildlife.
On the moor that we're on at the moment, approximately 50% of the moor is deep peat, and it is pretty much a blanket of heather from one side to the other, and at the moment we're not allowed to burn or cut actually at the moment on any of it.
Firefighters are still working this evening. Whether started deliberately or recklessly, they say these fires are among the most difficult to put out.
We're being pushed and pushed more towards cutting rather than burning in these areas, which I think probably has its place in the modern day, doing some cutting. I'm not totally against it, but as we've seen today on some of these fires, some of the fire breaks that we've used to stop the fire on were only cut 3 or 4 days ago, and we've had to get water on them to stop the fire crossing it. Now if you think of these areas 12 months on, after all the brash has been laid and dried out, you're pretty much left with a bed of matchsticks.
So I've noticed over your side there's areas that are cut and not burnt. Why is that?
So yeah, the areas that are cut are generally on the deep peat ground, the wetter areas of the moor. Deep peat being classified as over 40 centimetres of peat on the moor. And so we cut those areas due to Natural England thinking that heather burning is damaging on that area, but we think differently, and we actually think that burning and taking off the canopy and a nice cool fire on that blanket bog is actually beneficial for the bog. This is a kill burn from probably last back end, start of the burning season last year. You can just see how the fire's gone across the top and taken the canopy off the top, but all the stalks are left.
None of the woody stuff is burnt, is it?
No, exactly. All the stalks, as we call them, cowlings in Yorkshire. And the peat's way down in there, way down, so the fire just run across the top, not touching the peat at all. You've got this charcoal, which science is pointing towards this breaking down and putting more carbon back into the ground.
So this is actually sort of speeding up peat production over the natural cycle?
Exactly, yeah, it's benefiting the whole cycle, yeah.
Proper studies on heather burning are expensive and should be carried out over decades. I met up with Dr. Andreas Heinemeyer from the University of York, who is heading up a study comparing the effects of cutting and burning on heather landscapes.
Andreas, can you tell us a bit about your project here?
We are on a blanket bog, which is deep peat, so under your feet there are about 200 kilograms of carbon. Each step you take, it's 2.5 meters deep peat here, so it's a valuable carbon store. And the big question is, what happens leaving vegetation heather dominated, lots of biomass, unmanaged, compared to managing, to letting light in, because this is all very dark. So the mosses underneath, which are very important for carbon and water storage. So if I squeeze this, a lot of water comes out. It locks away the water, it locks away the carbon as well. So the question is, if we leave this unmanaged, is it better, is it worse? And we look at all the effects on carbon, on water, on greenhouse gas emissions and water quality, and we look at holistic picture of the ecosystem services. That's what we call it.
So what are the results so far?
So what we have been looking at in particular is water storage, because when you leave an area like this unmanaged, this really huge amount of vegetation, it transpires a lot of water. It dries out the peat because it needs to get the water from somewhere. And a dry peat is a bad peat, because then organisms will use the peat, break it down, eat it up and return it to the atmosphere. So we have really seen that leaving heather unmanaged dries out the peat compared to managed peat, where we have less of the dense heather. So the mown catchment here actually stores quite a lot of water, because you reduce that transpiration loss and you allow the moss to grow and to soak up the water. However, when we look over in the burn catchment, it is immediately after burning that you have lost a lot of vegetation. So again, it should be similar to the cat one, but actually, because it's a bit more bare, exposed area where you have really burned away the vegetation, the water tends to run off a little bit quicker. Yes, it does. So you reduce the water table depth compared to the cut one. So cutting stores more water compared to the burned catchment. That's what we see. However, this really changes. It's a short-lived impact, and I think that is so important, that our research is a long-term project. So far, most research projects have just worked short term, and then you see an immediate disturbance effect, you see a drastic reduction in water table depth, but nobody really has followed that over time. So after 3 to 5 years, actually the water table depth are exactly the same in the mown, in the burn catchment. And I think this is really important, because you need to then consider the other aspects of those ecosystem services, and that is carbon, for example. So what we found is that cutting and leaving the brush returns a lot of carbon to the peat, but we also measure actually over time that left brush, that biomass, decomposes year after year after year, and you actually create a huge loss just over a longer time. Whereas in the burnt one, when you burn this heather vegetation, about 80% during that burn event go straight up into the atmosphere. So it is a huge loss, and that's what people always tend to show. There's a huge loss of carbon compared to not doing anything or cutting. But you need to see the overall management rotation, and we are talking about 20 years here, or 25 even. So although you've lost a lot of carbon the first year, then the vegetation regrows much quicker, because your burning creates ash, charcoal. It's beneficial for nutrient provision of the heather and the other vegetation. So the regrowth is quicker. So you actually see a curve. You lose a lot and then it comes down very quickly. Whereas with the mown one, you don't lose that. You don't have the peak. You have a gradual loss over time. But then those curves disappear and get very different. And that's what we see now, that actually over 10 years, the carbon balance is very much the same between the cut and the burnt one. But the burnt one tends to take up more carbon now. So anyone's guess what it will look like in 10 years, but my money is on that actually there's a huge increase in further net carbon take on the burnt rotation.
So you say that this burnt area, after 10 years, is about parallel with the wet area for carbon and water quality. What's the effect of a wildfire on this sort of?
Yeah, so if we compare, so a controlled burn leaves all that charcoal in the sticks here, the carbon, and leaves the moss layer still intact and to recover over time, and that only seems to take a few years and then it's really regrown. Whereas a wildfire, the heat, because of that huge biomass, it would just burn all of this away and burn actually through the moss layer right into the peat, and once the peat ignites and it just burns down there, possibly hundreds of thousands of years of accumulated carbon could then be returned in that fire event. And any firefighter will tell you that that is potentially the worst fire to fight.
What happens after a wildfire?
Once it's out, then you've got to start trying to rebuild it. I mean, this piece of ground just above where we are, Bleaklow Summit, that was subjected to a wildfire in 2004. Burnt vegetation, it burnt the peat layer, it burnt the root bed and the seed stock. There's nothing left, it was just bare peat. Since then, there's £3.5 million spent on revegetation, mostly aerial application of lime seed and fert. The problem is now that we've got all that vegetation back in place, there's no means of controlling it. All we've got up there again is a ticking time bomb, and at some point it will happen again.
Are grouse moors responsible for wildfires?
Not at all, no. I mean, in 12 years of working in Peak District as head gamekeeper, I've never known one single fire by a professional gamekeeper on a driven grouse mower that's needed fire service in attendance. Yet, the wildfires that we're subjected to annually now, it's horrendous, you know, but it just leaves, you know, a disaster zone. Here we are, just 100 metres away from the previous site where I showed you where that barbecue had burnt into that bankside. And this was a wildfire that occurred on Good Friday. Intentional arson attack, it's an ongoing police investigation. My beekeeper was down at his house Friday evening, smelt smoke and came straight up. There was smoke billowing out of this clough side. When heathers left unmanaged, this is the result.
Why don't you manage this bank?
We're not allowed. We're not allowed to burn any heather on here at all. So I mean, from a wildfire point of view, the fuel load up here, it's just increasing year by year.
So you're having to cut everywhere only?
It's an option, but it doesn't remove the litter. So even though you're taking down the canopy, you're leaving huge amounts of combustible trash, which is still going to set on fire. It's not like a controlled burn where you remove the canopy and you remove quite a large amount of litter.
Is there not a lot of tracks up here?
Very limited access. You know, it's a huge issue in the Peak District.
What does that mean if a wildfire occurs?
It makes all the difference. You know, you speak to any fire service, when they attend a wildfire, the biggest issue they have is access. For a start, we've just seen the road, we can't get a fire engine in.
Yeah.
So the first thing we've got to do is get the staff from there up to the top of there. It could be 2 hours walk out with equipment. You know, and no matter who they are, the lads are knackered by the time we get there.
What's it like in a wildfire? Presumably you've gone to a few shouts.
Yeah.
What's it like?
Terrifying. I went to the Staley Bridge one, which was 2018. I mean, we're obviously used to dealing with fire. We've done a fair bit today, but as soon as nightfall came on that, it was home time, and it was a bit of a job gathering everybody up. The fire crew were pulling off at that point, and the great thing that the fire crew did that night, they brought a portable light which they put on top of the hill, and they used that to bring all their fire crew back. Of course, all the keepers that had gone were on a strange moor. It was a moor that hadn't been particularly shot for a few years. A lot of new keepers in the area, no one really knew the ground. And as the light faded, the fire had actually split into 12, 15 different fires and a swirling wind, and there were people getting caught in between all these fires. And it was as close to, it was as close to life-threatening as I've ever seen. And it just makes you wonder how much more dangerous these wildfires need to get before there's a slight policy change and we're allowed to burn some fire breaks in on the deep peat ground.
Are you paid for the firefighting work that you do, or is it just a community effort?
It's a community effort. We help each other out. And to be honest, the majority of the work we did on the Staley Bridge fire at Armfield is RSPB ground, strangely enough. but still more than going up in smoke, and everyone helps out really. So yeah, it needs nipping in the bud before it gets to that stage, and by putting these bits of fires in, little bits here and there, and putting these fire breaks in, it just allows us, if the worst would happen, just to get it under control before it gets to that scale.
To most of us in Britain, wildfires are not something that keep us up at night. But for these people, the threat to their lives, their homes, is real. Through changes in legislation, an increase in human traffic, and a general decrease in the respect for nature that this traffic has, the future is bleak. However, we can rest assured that these local men and women will keep fighting for their right to manage the land for the benefit of wildlife and to keep rural communities safe.